Hello, everyone. This is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Today's podcast episode is brought to you by the 5-day Vendor Master File Cleanup. Do you trust the data in your vendor master file? Well, if you have less than 5,000 active vendor records and need to prepare for a vendor self-registration portal or for 1099 and 1042 IRS annual forms distribution, you are in luck. We have vendor validations including watch list screening, duplicate vendor review, vendor inactivation recommendations, and more. Go to DeborahRRichardson.com. That's DeborahRichardson.com/consulting, or email me at Deborah, DEBRA, at DeborahRRichardson.com for a quote today. Today, we have a guest, Debbie Kirby, who has worked as an accounts payable manager. And actually, we are continuing with part 2 of our interview with Debbie. And part 1 was AP automation. And on today's episode, we are talking cybersecurity. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 66, Cybersecurity from an Accounts Payable Manager's View. So before we get started with the interview, I just want to let you know I did have some sound quality issues on my side, but be patient, it goes away, and enjoy the interview. So in part 1 of the interview, we talked about AP automation and the challenges that come with implementing new software in accounts payable. Yeah. What other challenges did you find kept you up at night as an accounts payable manager? I'm sure cybersecurity was one of them.
Yeah, cybersecurity was definitely on the list. We had training at least once a month, along with me sending emails to my staff to give them updates on different things that were going on, how they were able to get into systems. So we had, like, our bank would come out and do a training, or I would get someone, that I knew that was, that knew about cybersecurity, even if it was someone from our IT department. Mm-hmm. And they would come talk to my group. What you really had to do is really instill in them how important it was, because they would not see it until something happened. And then they would think, oh, that's not going to happen to us. So you were always having to keep that in their mind, that it's a problem, and explain to them, how different things happen. And I think one of the biggest helps was our IT department, because they knew these people, mm-hmm. And they would listen to them. The other thing was the vendor maintenance and setup. That was a big headache, because they would think that they didn't need to call and verify just because an attorney sent them the information for this vendor. They felt like they didn't need to call the vendor and verify that they were who they were. They should trust this attorney until they would have a problem. We had a couple of times where they set up a vendor and put the bank information in to do direct deposit, and it wasn't that vendor. Luckily we were able to get our money back, and it wasn't a lot of money. So, that taught them a lesson, I think.
Yeah, and that's a big gap there because, you still have a process that's either manual or mostly manual. You don't have a vendor registration, self-registration portal. That really puts the onus, on whomever's submitting that. And depending on your company, you could have an internal team member that has a relationship with the vendor and they're collecting all of that information, but you don't know if, they mistakenly got their information from crook.com, and then they submit it to the vendor maintenance team. And then really that's where the validations begin. But if you have a vendor self-registration portal, you take that internal team member out and you put the authentication right in the vendor self-registration portal. And then you have at least additional authentication that can reduce the potential for fraud. You still have to do your validations, and I think that call is still necessary, not just on banking information, but on anything that can affect payment, like a remit address. I think another good thing too is just make sure that as you're getting that information or the onus off of the internal team members, you're also reducing the potential that they're going to keep those W-9s and those banking forms. And one of the biggest things I found with implementing a vendor self-registration portal is I didn't realize just how much the internal team members kept that documentation, and you don't know that they're keeping it securely. They could just have it on their C drive. They're keeping that form and that W-9 just in case you need it again, so they don't have to go back to the vendor. So I think it is important to get that internal team member out of the middle and have it coming directly to vendor maintenance, which the portal satisfies that.
Right. I totally agree.
Yeah. Another good thing that the portals provide, if, everything's going great, you can think about eliminating that call because you've already authenticated the vendor, and kind of replace that with the notification to vendors once their accounts are updated. So the same way you or I go to Amazon or our banks and update our information, we get that email to say, hey, your information has been updated. If it wasn't you, let us know. And the portals can have that feature. And I think that's important to, eliminate all those extra manual steps that are being done when you're not automated.
Right. And the vendor that we implemented, it had that as well. But like with every program, in the beginning, we were still making that call
right.
Just safe, and then, after you get comfortable, I feel that you can do the same thing. Right. Like with any program that you have that will do that.
So in thinking about 2020, we're in I think I heard it called the roaring 20s. So it's here now, whole new decade. What do you think accounts payable teams should be focusing on?
I definitely think cybersecurity, because it's only going to get more challenging.
Yeah.
The more that we do electronically, the more that they are going to figure out.
Yep.
I've always said that if they would just have a real job, they could make lots of money. But they choose to do this, so, they make it more challenging for us. So I definitely think cybersecurity, and there again, we talked about vendor setup. It's also another big problem because of the security issues as well. So, if you don't have a system where you can set up the vendors and have all that security, you still have the problem with
right.
calling and making sure, that they are who they are. And don't ever call a number that somebody else gives you to call for the vendor. That's another big issue. Call the number that you have, because I know that we had problems with that as well. You trust the people that you work with too much. Like our secretaries and paralegals, they would trust them. Even I told them, even, our CFO or myself, if you receive something from us, question it. If it looks fishy or anything, question it. I know that in my experience, I had an email that came from our CFO telling me to transfer some money. And luckily, I knew her very well and I knew how she spoke.
Yeah.
And I was looking at that email and I'm like, she doesn't say stuff like that. She would just walk down the aisle and come to my office and tell me what she wanted in the first place, you know. And then I looked up there at the email at where it was coming from, and it had, instead of it having her first name dot last name at our firm, it had .org instead of .com. And, you know, I walked into her office and asked her, and she had no idea. So, you know, that happened to me a lot, because that's what would happen is they would look and see these emails that you're sending to people, and then they would try to send the same type of email to trick you, you know?
Right. So that must mean that somehow they were able to get in your system and monitor the email patterns. And that's another thing that, you know, is probably going to grow in 2020, because they get into these systems and they're, you know, it's not always where they just, you know, send a blast email out to 100,000 people and just wait for somebody to click or to respond to them. They're getting into these systems and they are waiting and monitoring, and they're waiting for when you think that payment needs to go out. And, you know, that whole CFO, business email compromise, CEO, CFO, email spoofing, you know, I almost think that accounts payable should almost do away with expecting the CEO or the CFO to send an email and say, hey, transfer these funds. They should just go through the regular process.
Right, exactly. And luckily, that's how our CFO was.
Mm-hmm.
She did try to follow the rules, as we said, and do the things the same way that everyone else did it. And she tried really hard not to make rushes.
Yeah.
Because, you know, that's another thing where they would make mistakes because they get rushed into doing something. And, you know, you're talking about the CFO or the controller, and, you know, they're intimidated somewhat.
Yes.
So they hurry up and try to get it done for them. And, you know, you just can't do that. They just have to be understanding. And hopefully the AP manager will have your back and talk to them about it, you know. And I think that really helps the communication for them to understand, you know, that we're trying to protect our assets, you know.
Right.
So I think that's a big thing too, as far as rushing accounts payable or your vendor maintenance person, you know, or whoever does the transfers, or, you know, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I always say too that your employees, team members, you know, can't be 100% of the time. You know, they're going to come in with their own distractions. Maybe they're sick, maybe their child is sick and they're coming in, or maybe they had, you know, an accident or the way to work, and they get into work and then they have quotas, deadlines, and so they're distracted. So no one's going to be 100% of the time. And so doing things like making sure that the CFO, the CEO, you know, are not sending those type of emails. So if you get one, then it's odd. And also putting other internal controls into place so that if for some reason they don't catch that it's a phishing email, then that internal control will catch it. So I think that's important too, because again, nobody can be 100% of the time.
Exactly.
So this has been great. I like talking about accounts payable, obviously, but I love talk about, you know, the challenges such as cybersecurity. I know you as an accounts payable manager are available for new opportunities in 2020. Where can the audience go to connect or engage with you?
Of course, on LinkedIn, or my email is dkirby, Kirby, 1262 @gmail.com.
Okay, so that was a great part 2 of the 2-part interview with Debbie Kirby, talking about AP automation in episode 65 and now cybersecurity episode 66. So thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 66th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.